I'll try to address this evolution of the politics and policies of Chile regarding inequality and segregation. And we'll go straight into the heart of the matter with this PISA table, PISA 209. Very difficult to see, but incredibly informative about the level of segregation in this huge list of countries, so from all over the place, from Northern Europe to my part of the world. You can see the arrows are signaling from less segmented schooling contexts, socially speaking, to more. And you can see that where is the OECD average, very the upper third part of the table, and well below the OECD average, the first Latin American country, the most mixed, socially speaking, in the schooling contexts is Brazil. Then comes further down Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, and at the very bottom of the table, my country. Chile, by the way, in the other tables of PISA, same year as in later years, throughout the last decade, has the best results in learning results, what PISA measures. Mathematics and reading abilities and science. But in terms of segmentation, the Chilean system in 2009, as is today, is in the worst position, with the most segmented educational system of all measured by PISA, with the exception of that little island, Macau, an ex-Dutch colony. How did we get here? Well, the obvious comparison here is with the rest of Latin America. There are very long historical reasons that put the whole of Latin America in more or less the same level of inequality and segmentation of their schooling arrangements. But in that context, how did it happen that obtaining good results comparatively and in terms of schooling outcomes, academic outcomes, in this regard is the worst? And for answering that, we need to do a detour, which is the attempt of my presentation. This is the timeline of the evolution of the politics and policies for equity and inclusion. Just after the transition from dictatorship to democracy in 1990, you can see that during the first decade, the attempts were through focalized programs of positive discrimination, more resources, more support to teachers, a bit more technology to the poorer 10% of the schools of Chile. And I won't go through the whole line because that will be the gist of the lecture. This proved to be completely insufficient. It did a difference to those schools, but it was only 10% of the enrollments, the poorer areas and rural education. And in terms of policies directly addressing the problem, the next step is completely of another scale. It's the preferential subvention law in 2007. Long 17 years after the transition to democracy. And I'll say something about this law that mainly leveled the financial basis of the system between groups, allocating a plus to the amount of resources given per child attending schooling throughout the system. And the next key step is 2015, the inclusion law. Much more ambitious and radical, not connected with the financial basis, but the actual social composition of schooling and the mechanisms which the paper by Belay and Contreras described, whereby a combination of market mechanisms and very sociological mechanisms of distinction among families of a hugely expanded new middle classes articulate and multiply the segmentation logic that for more than a decade and a half produced a highly segmented system. Yeah. With every group in terms of income attending or having the experience of schooling among their peers in terms of income and socio-cultural capital, interests, orientation, and so on. But before getting into this, describing the components of these two laws, I'll go through the history and the politics that it's underneath this culmination of the policy process, which is a law. The Spanish slide. What is interesting here, and we have time to comment, it's only the upper part of the slides. To visualize the zigzagging, dramatic of Chilean politics and their immense consequences for the provision and the characteristics of the education system. Between the 60s and the end of the 70s, it's a period that goes from modernization and democratization of education based on the state to the big crisis of Chilean democracy, inseparable from the project of the popular unity of President Salvador Allende and the Chilean left, at the time very orthodox Marxist left, a tragic confrontation, and which ended up in tears, and a big regime change, of course, as everyone knows, and a very long period of military dictatorship, which in its second part produced by the concentration of force intrinsic to a dictatorship of those characteristics, was able to impose the Big Bang pro-market revolution of the educational sector from 1981 to the end of the period, 1990. And then comes a long period, the one in which I participated, as Martin generously referred to you, of 4 governments, social democrats in orientation, which implemented coherent policies of quality and equity, which in a way strengthen the power of the state to regulate the system and to support the provision of education, without tampering, without reforming the market-based regulation of the system, without altering the competition of schools for enrollments, and so on. In 2006, a secondary students movement, which surprised everyone, and mainly the political class, triggered a huge critique of the educational arrangements that the country had reached by that time. And initiated a big and prolonged effort to, how could I put it, to reestablish the acceptance by society of its education system, which a quarter of a century before had been altered by the military dictatorship against the traditions, very state-centered traditions of the previous century-long history. So in 2006 opens up a period that has just ended, of a decade and a half of efforts to build new institutions and new regulations, more in agreement with the interests and political desires of society regarding education, I would say. Two political forces ideologically regarding education totally confronted, and of more or less equivalent force had to negotiate the changes, and it's behind this evolution that I'll show in some details. It's a period, this is fascinating, it's a period that society twice chose a socialist president, and twice in the same period chose a right-wing president. Today, the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, was also a president in 2010. And in both occasions, he succeeded the presidency of the socialist president, Michel Bachelet. So from a sociological and political standpoint, it's a very complex and fluid period in which you could say society in search of answers and zigzagging in this dramatic way. I'll skip this one. If you want a synoptic view of the first period, the 16 years period of policies of quality and equity, this one would be a valid representation of those governments implementing more or less coherently the same vision of a combination of market and state mechanisms. Very, very, very much third way policies. At the heart, a reform that expanded time in schooling, a systemic curriculum reform that redefined contents towards more complex and richer provision of opportunities, and also a huge transformation of the means, from buildings to ICT, to provision, universal provision of textbooks and school libraries and so on, which impacted quality consistently throughout the 2000s onwards. I have underlined on top of the slide that it belongs to this period, something which has a, in view of all the interpreters of the segmentation problem, all of them see this measure consisting in allowing the families to put money on top of the public funding of their children as a key factor in this stratification, layer by layer of income level of the schooling system of the country, which the last law I will refer to dismantled and prohibited. The co-payment was a measure which had no relation whatsoever with the principles and the third way politics and policies of the time when this was approved, very early on in 1993. And it was the result of a transaction, political transaction between the first government of democracy, government of President Elwin, which had received a budget defined by the previous government, by Pinochet, which was a third less than for education, I mean, than in 1982. The dictatorship diminished its expenditure in education throughout the 80s. And the new democratic government was trying to obtain funding for improving education from the different sources available. And in the negotiation of the maintenance of the VAT tax with a surcharge of 1 point in order to finance social expenditure, the right at the time considered that 1 point more of VAT against this, at the time, it looked like a tiny modification of the rules regarding the funding of the schooling system. And the tiny modification, it got transformed in a river that inundated the valley.
Christian,
Yes.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
However, your point, I agree completely with what you just said, but it is also a fact that a study was done by, I forget her first name, Rounds at Georgia, that showed that people were paying anyway under the table. So schools were accepting money from private subsidized schools were accepting additional money from parents. So in a sense, it was a sort of an acceptance of a reality that the cheating was going on anyway. Do you understand my point?
Yes, absolutely. But this change, Martin and colleagues, changed the volume completely. The schools were charging under the table probably, but marginally. Some monies which were marginal. The modification, the legal permission to charge transform the economic basis of the private subvencionado in Chile, and and transform the logic of how the schools competing for enrollments order their projects and priorities, and discover that there were niches, and discover that what was at stake for them was a market of reputations. And it was the easiest way to compete in that kind of setup was to select your students and families, and so on and so forth. And the stratification, the system was unequal before this, no doubt about that. But it was stratified in a completely different pattern, much more mixed, and with a much more wider presence of the public system. Now with this new mechanism, and with the cultural influence of very meritocratic credo, every couple with children with some money to spend in education started to put it in education, and the schooling system started to answer to this most basic desire and interest of the parents. And in a decade, there were schools that charge 5,000 pesos, very different from those that charge 15,000 pesos, and so on, up to 50,000 pesos, which was the limit allowed. So a very important measure. Let me share with you that at the time, the Ministry of Education opposed the copayment, argued his point to the Minister of Hacienda, and to the president, but didn't win. And and financiamiento compartido was on for 2 decades with very dire effects. Martin has written a lot about comparisons of results in Latin America, and very justly foregrounded that that Chile, with these policies, and in spite of the market side of them, shortened the distance between its elite and the poorer groups purely in terms of SIMSA result. SIMSA is the national census test in language, maths, history, and science. And what I am showing in this slide is that during the decade of 2000, the lower groups, which are the ones that are in the first 2 rows of the table, improved their results. This is the 4th grade in language and math, very significantly, and much more than all the other groups in the middle of the table. And and as a result of this differential pattern of results throughout the decade, the distance between the head and the tail of the system shortened in a completely counterintuitive way. And this has not changed. This did not change in the last decade. Good results and impact of the policies, particularly in the lower groups, and in terms of that view of equity, improvements in equity. This is the paradox of Chile. Better quality, better equity from this viewpoint, and very strong segmentation. This is the mix. It's part of the picture as well, the systematic expansion of the private but publicly funded sector, the red curve, and the systematic as well fall of the enrollments in the municipal or state-run schools. We won't get into this side of things. This, at the end of Bachelet II's government, brought in a new law, and that is going to, it's being implemented right now, which is attempting to redress this and strengthen and expand public enrollments. Well, this state of things was analyzed and put to the government very early on in 2004 by a review by OECD, where Professor Carnell played a coordinating and key role. This phrase most probably comes from his pen. And I quote it because what comes immediately after this, in 2006, the Pingüino, the penguin movement of the secondary students. Penguin because the school uniform made them resemble penguins. Well, the leadership of penguins quoted the OECD report in their demands, their political demands for change in education. Fascinating. The report was asked by the Chilean government. Half of it was written and developed by the government. The other part was this external view, which put to the government of the time, social democrat government, this key major transversal point. You have put too much trust in mechanisms that are producing things that you are not desiring nor searching for. It was a big falling of the bell. More of that report. I can share with you again. I was part of the group. I was part of the planners and experts in the ministry that believed their plans and curriculum definitions and new ways in pedagogy were being implemented. But the teams of OECD walking through Chilean classrooms did not see what the ministry said was going on. We took this very seriously. And society and this social movement of students took this very seriously. The movement, for a month, the classes interrupted. Huge public support to these high school students. Asking very political demands. Change of the general law, and to the municipal administration of schools, and criticisms to the full-day schooling reform. The last one ebbed away. It wasn't relevant. It didn't cut any eyes. The other two had huge consequences. And it took, as I said, more than a decade for the political system to absorb and answer to this movement. The Pingüinos in Alameda, the main avenue in downtown Santiago, May 2006. The government at the time, presided by Michelle Bachelet, convoked a big group, very plural politically, institutionally, generationally. There were 12 representatives of the student movement, both high level, of schooling level, and university level, together with senators and bishops and experts, of course. This is the final, and the president asked this Consejo Asesor, advisory council, to convene a diagnosis and a proposal, a set of proposals to get through this petition of society to have a fairer and better educational system. Well, the group, predictably enough, was not very good at producing agreed proposals. And after 6 months of work, the report had too many differences within both in the diagnosis and the proposals. What was at the heart of the movement? This is one of the very amazing leaders. The leaders were four of them, two girls and two boys. Karina Delfino, she's answering a very fine sociologist, Chilean sociologist, Sofia Donoso, ending her thesis in Oxford and asking her interpretation about the Penguino movement. She's in the university at that time, 3 years after leaving high school, and this is the answer. The answer has to do with segmentation and inequality of chances. The most educated generation of secondary students in the history of the country, all of them, not all of them, 3/4 of them, aiming to for the first time in the history of the country, and for many of them, for the first time in the history of their families, aiming to the university very realistically, and discovering that that avenue of progress was highly segmented, and their chances had decisively to do with the schools that they had gone in the previous experience. And this was unacceptable, of course, in a very meritocratic and democratic society. And she is voicing this. If you go to a school, a municipal school with a number, not even a name, you are destined to get 400 points in the university entry exam. And then the rest is determined. I was always told that if I did not get into Liceo 1, elite public education, everything would end badly. Well, she got to the Liceo 1. She's in her uniform, you can see L1, and led very impressively this movement. So skipping things and details, you could say that as from 2006 to the present, until 2018, for a decade and a half, through 4 governments of different political sign, the political system of Chile processed the demands for equity of 2 social movements of students. There isn't time to comment on the university student movement of 2011. So the political system processing a demand by society and processing through, as I said, different governments and throughout a long period. And the interesting and fascinating thing in comparative terms, comparative to Latin America especially, is that the trajectory, in spite of the differences in context and ideologies and interests of the different governments, the trajectory, the north of the movement is more or less coherent. And it is indeed answering to the demands of society, if you put it, if you accept that the young generation supported by society and the press and so on represents what goes on in civil society. So I'll describe the 2 laws and then I shut up and listen to you. The first law, 207, you can immediately discover by the year that it cannot be an answer to a movement by by the students in 206. It comes from 4 years of elaboration previous to the crisis of the student movement. Whereas, in contrast, the inclusion law is the second attempt, I'll explain that, to answer to the demands of 206. I'll describe very briefly the subvención preferencial. Basically, this is the effort to level the field. Because of the co-payment, remember, the co-payment is on top of the public funding of every student. So since 1993, we are in 2007, for more than a decade, the delta produced by the families actually produce an inclination of the field. The subvención regular, which was the same to every child and girl of the country, was being supplemented in the case of the private subsidized schools, producing a very uneven field. And subvención escolar preferencial redresses this. Actually, what it does, it compensates. It compensates in public education for the co-payment in the private subvencionado sector, and puts about, I'll see puts a lot of money on top of the subvention, more or less equivalent to what the families of the more affluent groups were adding up to the subvention. These additional resources, and this is typical of new public management and this mixing of innovation and resource to incentives, rules, state and market mechanisms. The schools had to apply for this special allocation of resources. And the application had to include a plan of improvement. And the school had to be accountable against this plan in order to maintain the allocation of the subvención preferencial. So more resources, leveling the field, but the schools having to set up and to answer proactively in terms of improvement plans and accountability and specification of goals and so on and so forth. The inclusion law is the last stage in this very long story of starting with focalized programs in the early 90s, then in 2007 producing the leveling of the field that I have just referred, which touched 40% of the enrollments, 1.9 million students at first, and then 80% of the enrollments. The fourth phase is the one in which the concept of inclusion goes much further than equality of access, equality of the capacity to stay, to remain at school until your 12th year in secondary education, but to have your experience, your schooling experience in contexts which in socio-cultural terms are not segregated, are contexts of social and cultural mixture, of plurality, of encounter with others which are real others. This is the main goal of the law, which has three components, all of them full of implications, at the heart of the system that produced that place in the PISA ranking. The first one, end to co-payment. No family, as from the promulgation of the law onwards, is able to put monies in their schools. First. Second, crucial, very difficult to implement, but I'll say something about this. End to the mechanisms of selection by the schools of their intake. The Chilean system had evolved consistently against Friedman's principle, parents choosing schools. It was reversed. Schools chose children and their families. And this law puts an end to that, and puts an end to that through a mechanisms of selection which is universal, a very sophisticated lottery. Its definition. And thirdly, an end to the possibility for every school owner receiving public funding to divert as profit a single peso of the subvention. So prohibition of profit making, public funding, end to co-payment, and end to selection of students. That's the inclusion law, promulgated in 2015. And an important fact, the law is being implemented. It was the start of the implementation was during the President Bachelet years, and the continuation of the implementation is by Piñera's government, which was critical of particularly of the selection and the the rulings of the law regarding selection, but didn't alter that. To change that law, it didn't have the political clout to do that, and it's being implemented with no problems, no major problems. I'll stop immediately after this. The system is the new system of selection is centralized. First, second is it combines, as I said, some criteria, which I referred immediately, with randomness, with lottery. The criteria are the following. If you have brothers or sisters at school, you have a first priority to get into that school. The second one is there has to be a 15% of the enrollments of that school belong to priority students. Priority students, that means belonging to the lower income bracket. That's the second criteria. The third is sons and daughters of funcionarios, members of the ministry or the school, sorry. And the fourth is alumni. If you were a student in a school, left it, and want to come back, you have a priority on top of the lottery. So a combination of these criteria with randomness. As far as I know, it's a very complex algorithm. The ministry asked the help of engineers from the best US centers to set it up. And it has been at work since 2016 with no problem and increasing acceptance by the families. I leave in the slide for everyone interested to see the details of the system. To expand this was taken yesterday from the ministry's website regarding this sistema de admisión escolar. This is the final slide, which I want to comment. It's a comment on history and politics. It's an explanation as well of the peculiarity of the schooling system of Chile regarding the comparison with Latin America and with much of the rest of the world, actually. And the name of that peculiarity is that Chilean schools, the box on your right, the horizontal gray line, where the proveedores, where the institution, the school institution is, that point is regulated doubly. Chilean schools are subjected to a double accountability. The long, arduous to set it up, arduous to get implemented, accountability that comes from politics, deliberated and agreed upon in Congress and transformed in laws and reglamentos and specific regulations about schooling and the school experience. La ruta larga, the long way that goes from voice, Hitchman, voice, a social movement, which gets articulated and answered by political parties and parliament and government and transformed in the arrow that goes down as marco normativo, as the new state public regulation of the system. At the same time, the system conserves the short accountability of the competition for students. The Chilean system maintains that the funding, the public funding, is a subvention per student. And every time that the student leaves or chooses a given institution, is manifesting the pressure and behind that, the evaluation, the accountability, direct, short, of families asking an institution to answer them in terms of whatever idea and expectation they have about quality, the best education for the children. Behind these two roots, the long, protracted, and more or less drawn dispute, competition, political competition between the Chilean right and the center and its left, between social democrats and neoliberals. market-oriented and state-oriented visions about how to regulate and improve education. I'll leave it there.